I swear, I only turned my back for a second, and just like that, 20 years of roots, shade, and bird songs were gone, flattened, so the HOA could build 150 soulless boxes with fake stone panels and zero charm. I'm not saying I believe in karma, but what happened next sure felt like something was keeping score. This story gets a little wild and yeah, maybe a little muddy, but if you've ever watched a landscaping decision turn into a full-blown disaster, I'd love to hear it. Drop your HOA horror stories in the comments, and hey, subscribe to QA Stories if you want more petty chaos like this. For 20 years, I poured my heart and soul into transforming a barren plot of land into what I can only describe as a green paradise. Every single morning, I'd wake up to the sound of birdsong echoing through branches I'd watched grow from saplings. Every evening, I'd walk through my garden, watering plants in that golden sunset light, feeling like I was living in some kind of peaceful dream. This wasn't just a garden to me. This was my soul, my legacy, my life's work. I'm not even sure why I'm getting so emotional talking about it now, but I raised everything from seed, trees, bushes, flower beds, for 20 years. I knew those trees like family, every root, every winter. Then Victoria Sterling swept in, suburban tornado and oppressed blazer. I still remember that community meeting where she first announced her grand plans. She walked into the room wearing one of those perfectly pressed blazer outfits, her blonde hair styled like she'd just stepped out of a magazine, and that smile, God, that smile was so fake it could have been made of plastic. She stood up there at the front of the room, cleared her throat with this dramatic little cough, and announced with the most entitled tone I'd ever heard, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to share that 150 modern homes will transform this outdated area into a model neighborhood that will be the envy of the entire county." I felt my stomach drop the moment those words left her mouth. I raised my hand slowly, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer to my question. "Excuse me, Victoria," I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though my heart was already pounding. "What exactly happens to the old trees? Some of them have been growing here for decades." The room went quiet, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. Victoria's smile got even wider, if that was possible, and she flipped her hair in this dismissive way that made my skin crawl. "Do you mean trim them or cut them all down?" I asked. She smiled like I was slow. "Smaller ones will be prettier and easier. These are outdated." The way she said outdated while looking directly at me, I knew right then that Victoria Sterling and I were going to have problems. But I had no idea just how far she was willing to go to get what she wanted. Looking back, I should have known that someone who could dismiss 20 years of careful cultivation as outdated landscaping wasn't going to listen to reason. Instead, I went home and spent hours staring out at my trees, trying to convince myself that maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe they really would just do some light trimming. Maybe I was overreacting. God, I wish I could go back and shake some sense into myself. The next morning, I woke up to a sound that still gives me nightmares. Chainsaws. Dozens of them, roaring like a death choir. I threw on the first clothes I could find and ran outside, my bare feet slipping on the dewy grass. What I saw when I reached my property line, I'm not sure I'll ever get that image out of my head. Those trunks, my companions, crashed like thunder. The sound wasn't just mechanical noise. It was like listening to the forest itself crying out in agony. Victoria Sterling stood there in the middle of it all, supervising the destruction with her arms crossed and wearing designer sunglasses that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She looked like she was directing a photo shoot, not a demolition. When she saw me running toward the chaos, she actually had the audacity to wave at me like we were old friends meeting for brunch. I screamed over the noise of the chainsaws. "You're killing them! These trees have been growing here for decades." My voice was hoarse and desperate, but she just shrugged like I was complaining about the weather. "I'm improving property values," she replied with that same smug attitude, not even bothering to remove her sunglasses to look at me properly. "You should be thanking me, actually. These old trees were just taking up valuable space." I stood there, watching helplessly as the last of my 20-year-old oak trees crashed to the ground, feeling like I was watching my own family members being murdered. Agnes McCall, an elderly neighbor I'd always respected, stood in the distance shaking her head sadly. There was something in her eyes, something that looked almost like she'd seen this kind of thing before. When the last tree fell and the chainsaws finally went silent, I felt something change in the air around us. It was subtle at first, just this strange heaviness that seemed to settle over the empty lot where my garden used to be. The workers started packing up their equipment, leaving behind nothing but stumps and sawdust where 2 decades of careful growth had stood just hours before. I stood there in the sudden quiet, feeling completely hollow inside, but also sensing something else, something that felt almost like the earth itself was whispering to me, trying to tell me something important. I didn't know if it was just my imagination running wild with grief, or if it was actually some kind of warning about what was coming next. Instead of just sitting around feeling sorry for myself and complaining to anyone who'd listen, I decided to take action. I'm not normally the type to go looking for a fight, but something about Victoria Sterling's smug attitude had lit a fire under me that I couldn't ignore. I read every page of the HOA handbook, 200 mind-numbing pages of paint colors and petty rules. Most of it was standard stuff about lawn maintenance and paint colors, but buried deep in the fine print I found some interesting phrases. Things like landscape improvements for community benefit and aesthetic enhancement projects. The vague language gave her free rein, legal weaponry masked as guidelines. The more I read, the more I realized that our HOA handbook was essentially a blank check for anyone with enough ambition and ruthlessness to use it. I'm not a lawyer, but even I could see that most of these regulations were written so broadly that they could be interpreted any way the board wanted. But I needed more than just suspicious legal language if I was going to build any kind of case against Victoria. I needed to understand who I was really dealing with, and that's when I decided to pay a visit to Agnes McCall. Agnes had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else, and there was something about the way she'd watched the tree cutting that told me she knew more than she was letting on. I found her one afternoon tending to her own small garden, moving slowly but deliberately among her flower beds. When I approached her fence and asked if we could talk, she looked up at me with these sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through to my soul. "You want to know about Victoria Sterling?" she asked with a bitter smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, you'd better sit down and have some tea with me, young man. This story isn't a short one, and you're going to need to understand exactly what kind of person you're dealing with." Agnes led me to her back porch and poured 2 cups of tea from a pot that looked like it had been in her family for generations. Her hands shook slightly as she served the tea, but her voice was steady and clear when she started talking. "She made me repaint my house, white to cream, because it didn't match her aesthetic vision. 30 years, and suddenly I was non-compliant." She paused to sip her tea, and I could see the memory still bothered her after all these years. I refused at first, obviously. This was my home, and I'd been living here since before Victoria Sterling even knew this neighborhood existed. But she didn't give up. She fined me, threatened me, made my life miserable for months. Finally, I had enough and decided to fight back legally. I hired a lawyer and sued her for harassment and exceeding her authority as HOA president. Agnes smiled then, and for the first time since I'd known her, it looked genuinely happy. I won that case, by the way. The judge ruled that Victoria had no legal right to force me to change my house color based on her personal preferences. Agnes leaned forward in her chair like she was about to share a secret. "Here's the thing you need to understand about Victoria Sterling, Ethan. She never forgets when someone challenges her authority, and she never forgives anyone who makes her look bad in public. That woman holds grudges like it's her full-time job." Agnes stood up and walked to an old cabinet inside her house, returning with a banker's box that looked like it had seen better days. She handed me a dusty box, 5 years' worth of receipts, emails, and every dirty deal. Inside that box was a treasure trove of information that made my head spin. There were copies of contractor agreements that seemed deliberately vague about safety standards and building codes. Internal emails between Victoria and various board members discussing how to handle residents who protested her decisions. Safety reports that had clearly been altered after the fact, with original recommendations crossed out and replaced with more favorable assessments. Financial documents showing payments to contractors who weren't properly licensed for the work they were doing. It was like looking at a roadmap of corruption and incompetence that stretched back years. "Victoria Sterling isn't a community leader," Agnes said, watching me flip through the documents with growing amazement. She's a control freak with an official title who treats this neighborhood like her personal kingdom. She surrounds herself with people who are either too scared to question her or too invested in her success to care about the consequences. Agnes pulled out one particular email that made my blood run cold. It was from Victoria to a contractor, discussing ways to cut corners on a previous project to maximize profits. The casual way she discussed potentially dangerous shortcuts was horrifying. As I sat there, reading through years of documented evidence, I started to understand that my tree situation was just the latest in a long pattern of Victoria Sterling doing whatever she wanted without regard for rules, safety, or common decency. This wasn't mismanagement. This was a blueprint for abuse. And she'd gotten away with it for years. Looking at all that evidence spread out on Agnes's table, I felt a mixture of anger and determination that surprised me with its intensity. When I finally looked up from the documents, Agnes was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Now you know what you're really dealing with," she said quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I gathered up copies of the most damaging documents and thanked Agnes for trusting me with this information. As I walked home with that evidence tucked under my arm, I realized I'd just opened Pandora's box. I was committed now, whether I liked it or not. I was ready for this fight. But I couldn't help wondering if Victoria Sterling was ready for me. Something told me I was about to find out. Armed with Agnes's evidence, I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote what I thought was a pretty impressive formal letter to the HOA board. This wasn't a rant. I sent them real questions. Permits, reports, violations, backed by evidence. I referenced actual regulations and quoted from the documents Agnes had shared with me. I felt like I was finally fighting smart instead of just fighting mad. The letter was professional, detailed, and backed up with evidence. I was actually proud of it when I dropped it in the mailbox. Clara Monroe, the HOA secretary, responded within a week with an email so dry and bureaucratic it could have been generated by a computer. "Dear Mr. Vance," it read, "Thank you for your recent correspondence regarding the Meadowbrook Development Project. Please be assured that this project fully complies with all local and state regulations. All resident concerns have been thoroughly reviewed by qualified professionals and addressed appropriately. We appreciate your continued interest in community affairs." I wrote a second letter, this one even longer and more detailed, and got back the exact same response, word for word identical. Same generic language, same dismissive tone, same complete lack of any actual answers to my questions. They saw me as noise, an old man with time to kill. I was getting ready to write an even more aggressive third letter when something happened that nobody could have predicted. Mother Nature decided to weigh in on the situation herself, and she had her own ideas about how this whole thing should play out. I'm still not sure if what happened next was just a coincidence, or if the earth really was as angry about those fallen trees as I was. It started as a perfectly normal, sunny afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen window, looking out at the construction site where my garden used to be, when I noticed dark clouds rolling in from the west. At first I didn't think much of it. Afternoon thunderstorms weren't unusual for that time of year, but these clouds were different somehow. They were darker, more ominous, and they were moving faster than seemed natural. Within minutes, the sky went from clear blue to an angry gray-black that made the whole neighborhood look like it was under some kind of curse. Then the rain started, and this wasn't your typical summer shower. The sky cracked open, sheets of rain like something biblical. But here's the thing that really got my attention. Without those tree roots that had spent 20 years growing deep into the ground and holding the soil together, that rainwater had nowhere to go, except straight down into the construction site. I watched in fascination as the water poured into the foundation holes they'd been digging for the new houses. Within 30 minutes of the rain starting, I could see muddy water pooling everywhere, turning the construction site into what looked like a series of small lakes. The workers who'd been there when the storm started were running around trying to cover equipment and secure anything that might blow away, but it was too late. The damage was already happening right before my eyes. Equipment tilted, sunk, swallowed like toys in wet clay. One of them tilted at such a dangerous angle that the operator had to jump out and run to safety. A large crane that had been set up to pour concrete foundations was leaning so far to one side that it looked like it might topple over completely. The construction supervisor was standing in the middle of it all, shouting orders that nobody could hear over the sound of the rain, and trying to coordinate some kind of damage control that was clearly hopeless. I grabbed my phone and started recording the whole scene, partly because I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and partly because I had a feeling this footage might come in handy later. Victoria Sterling showed up about 20 minutes into the chaos, and seeing her was almost worth all the stress of the past few weeks. Her usually perfect hair was plastered to her head, her designer outfit was covered in mud, and she was screaming into her phone while trying to coordinate some kind of emergency response. The woman who'd been so confident and dismissive just days earlier was now standing in the middle of a disaster that was completely beyond her control. But what really caught my attention was Claire Monroe. She wasn't panicked like the others, just watching. I caught her looking at my house more than once. There was something in her expression that I couldn't quite read, but it definitely wasn't the blind loyalty I would have expected from Victoria's right-hand person. The rain finally stopped after about an hour, but the damage was done. The construction site looked like a war zone, with equipment half buried in mud and foundation holes filled with water that would take days to pump out. Later I heard the storm cost them over $50,000 and a month's delay. As I stood at my window watching Victoria Sterling try to salvage her perfect development project, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I'd seen Victoria Sterling look genuinely rattled. Her confidence had cracked, even if just for a moment, and I'd gotten a glimpse of what she looked like when things didn't go according to her carefully laid plans. But even as I enjoyed watching her scramble to deal with the crisis, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. I had no idea if what I'd just witnessed was the end of Victoria's development dreams, or if it was just going to make her more determined than ever to push forward. Something told me I was about to find out which kind of person she really was. After watching that muddy disaster unfold, I knew I needed help from someone who actually understood what was happening from a technical standpoint. I'm a landscape architect, not a geological engineer, and while I could see that something was seriously wrong with that construction site, I needed an expert to explain exactly how wrong it was. That's when I noticed Dr. Eris Thorne, a new neighbor who'd moved in about 6 months earlier. I'd seen him standing at his front fence several times over the past few weeks, watching the construction site with what looked like genuine concern. The way he studied the site, this wasn't casual interest. There was something methodical about how he observed the work, taking notes on a small pad he always carried. One morning, I decided to take a chance and approach him directly. I found him watching the crew struggle with flood pumps and cleared my throat to get his attention. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart was pounding. "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Ethan Vance, and I couldn't help but notice that you seem pretty interested in what's going on over there. Are you in the construction business by any chance?" Dr. Thorne turned to look at me, and I could see him weighing whether or not he wanted to get involved in what was obviously a neighborhood controversy. His eyes had that sharp intelligence you see in people who've spent decades solving complex problems. "I'm retired," he said carefully, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I'd never dragged neighbors into HOA drama before, but this wasn't normal. But then he paused and looked back at the construction site, and I saw his professional curiosity override his desire to stay out of trouble. "But since you asked, yes, I do see something wrong over there. I was a geological engineer for 35 years, and what I'm watching happen to that site, it's not good." The way he said "not good" made my stomach drop, because it sounded like the kind of understatement engineers use when they're looking at something truly catastrophic. I could see him fighting an internal battle between professional ethics and the desire to stay out of neighborhood politics. I invited him back to my house for coffee, figuring that if I was going to get him to open up about what he was seeing, I needed to create a comfortable environment where he felt safe to speak honestly. Over coffee, I showed him the soil map Agnes and I dug up at City Records. It was an old document dating back to the 1980s, but it showed the geological composition of our entire neighborhood in detail. Dr. Thorne studied that map for a long time, occasionally pulling out a pair of reading glasses to examine specific sections more closely. I watched his expression change from professional interest to genuine alarm as he traced the soil composition lines with his finger. "Oh no," he said finally, and the quiet horror in his voice made me stop what I was doing and pay complete attention. "This is much worse than I thought." He pointed to a section of the map that covered exactly where Victoria's development was being built. "This is clay soil. Wet, it shifts. Dry, it cracks. And they just tore out the roots holding it together." He looked up at me over his glasses, and I could see genuine concern in his eyes. "Do you understand what that means?" The technical implications were starting to sink in, and I realized we weren't just talking about property damage anymore. This was about people's lives. I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going, but I needed to hear him say it out loud. "Tell me," I said, sitting down across from him at my kitchen table. Dr. Thorne spread the soil map out between us and pointed to the construction site area. "It means that if we get another heavy rain like the one we just had, those 150 houses they're planning to build could literally sink into the ground like ships going down at sea. The soil underneath them won't be able to support that kind of weight without a root system to hold it together." His voice had taken on the measured tone of someone explaining a disaster that hasn't happened yet, but absolutely will. I thought this was about trees, but he was talking about homes sinking, families at risk. Hundreds of families could potentially be living in houses that might collapse into unstable soil if the weather conditions were wrong. I'd heard stories like this before on QA Stories and other channels, but I never imagined I'd be living in the middle of one myself. The scope of what we were discussing felt overwhelming, like we'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a neighborhood dispute. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I asked, even though I could see from his expression that he was completely serious. Dr. Thorne nodded grimly and pulled out his phone to show me some photos he'd apparently been taking of the construction site. "Look at these foundation holes," he said, scrolling through images that showed the flooding damage from different angles. "See how the water is just sitting there instead of draining away naturally? That's because the clay soil underneath is impermeable when it's saturated. It's like trying to build on top of a giant sponge that never dries out." The photos told a story that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just poor planning, it was dangerous negligence. He walked me through every crack, shift, and slope. It was worse than I thought. Cracks in the soil that indicated shifting and instability. Areas where the ground had started to subside even before the rain hit. Equipment marks that showed how the heavy machinery was compacting the soil in ways that would make the problem even worse. It was like getting a crash course in why everything about this development was doomed to fail. Dr. Thorne's expertise was painting a picture of inevitable disaster that made my blood run cold. "Would you be willing to help me document this properly?" I asked, knowing that I was potentially asking him to put himself in Victoria Sterling's crosshairs. "I understand if you don't want to get involved, but if what you're telling me is true, we're talking about a situation that could hurt a lot of innocent people. Would you stay silent or speak up if you knew hundreds of families could be in danger?" Dr. Thorne was quiet for a long time, staring at the soil map and obviously weighing the risks of getting involved against the moral obligation to speak up about a dangerous situation. I could see the weight of his professional knowledge battling against years of wanting to avoid conflict. Finally, he looked up at me with a resigned expression that told me he'd made his decision. "I'll help you," he said, "but I want you to understand what we're getting into. Once we start, there's no going back. She won't fight fair." I appreciated his honesty, but I also knew we didn't really have a choice. Staying quiet felt more dangerous than speaking up. The evidence was too clear, the potential consequences too severe to ignore. As Dr. Thorne gathered up his photos and prepared to leave, he turned back to me with a warning that I'll never forget. "Just remember, Ethan, we're going to be challenging someone who's used to getting her way, and who has the resources and connections to make our lives very difficult if she decides we're a threat to her plans." I nodded, understanding the implications, but I also knew I'd reached the point where staying silent felt more dangerous than speaking up. I wondered if I was strong enough to face the coming storm. Victoria called a meeting to spin the flood as just weather, but I came with receipts. I knew this was my chance to present the evidence Dr. Thorne and I had gathered, but I also knew I'd only get one shot at this before Victoria found a way to shut me down permanently. The meeting was held in the community center, and when I walked in, I could see that Victoria had come prepared for battle. She came dressed like she was testifying in Congress, not a hair out of place. She had a stack of official-looking documents at her place at the front table, and that confident smile that said she was completely in control of the situation. The room was packed with residents who looked anxious and confused, clearly hoping someone would give them answers about their investments. Dear residents, she began with that fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. I want to address the concerns some of you may have about last week's unfortunate weather incident. I want to assure everyone that what happened was simply a minor setback caused by an unusually severe storm. We have comprehensive solutions already in place, including deeper foundation systems and enhanced drainage infrastructure. I've personally overseen every detail of our response plan, and I can guarantee that your investments are completely safe. The way she emphasized, personally overseen, made it sound like she'd been out there in hard hat and work boots, when we all knew she'd been standing around in designer clothes, pointing at other people to fix her mess. A man I didn't recognize raised his hand, and I could hear genuine worry in his voice when he spoke. I've already put down $20,000 on one of these houses, he said. Can you absolutely guarantee that my family will be safe living there? Victoria's smile got even wider, and she spoke like we were confused children, patronizing, polished, fake. Sir, your house will be completely safe, she said with that tone she'd perfected. We're using the most advanced construction technology available, and we have the full backing of certified engineers and contractors. Trust me when I tell you that I know exactly what I'm doing here. I could see other residents nodding along, wanting to believe her reassurances, but something in her delivery felt rehearsed and hollow. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stood up, slowly, feeling my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say, but standing there in front of the entire community, with Victoria Sterling staring at me like I was some kind of annoying insect, I almost lost my nerve. What about the soil? I asked. You removed the roots. That land's not stable. Dr. Thorne followed. 35 years in soil engineering, he said. The site can't hold those homes, not after the rain. The room went dead quiet, and I could feel everyone's attention focused on what I was about to reveal. Victoria's confident expression flickered for just a moment, like she hadn't expected anyone to bring actual expertise to challenge her claims. But I wasn't going to stop at just pointing out technical problems. I pulled out the emails Agnes had shared with me, the ones that showed Victoria had known about potential issues and chosen to ignore them. You knew the risks, I said. I've got emails showing you ignored engineers and sold homes anyway. I read directly from one of the emails, my voice getting stronger as I realized how damning the evidence really was. Quote, the cost to implement proper foundation safety measures is approximately $2 million. I've decided to proceed with the original specifications to ensure project profitability remains on target. Customers don't need to be burdened with technical details they wouldn't understand anyway. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see Victoria's face going pale as she realized exactly what I was holding. People exploded. Demands, threats, panic, trust snapped in an instant. People demanding to know how long Victoria had been hiding, safety concerns, others asking if their deposits could be refunded immediately. Someone shouted that they were going to call their lawyer. Another person said they were reporting this to the county building inspector. She tried to talk over the crowd, failed. Her usual confident demeanor was cracking under the pressure of suddenly being exposed as someone who put profits ahead of people's safety. The polished facade she'd maintained for years was disintegrating in real time, and everyone could see the calculation behind her concern for the community. If you were in this situation, would you still trust someone like that? This is a misunderstanding, she said, but her voice had lost that commanding tone she usually used. These emails are being taken out of context. I would never put anyone's safety at risk for financial gain. But the damage was done. The community had heard her own words read back to her, and they could see that she'd been willing to gamble with their families' lives to protect her profit margins. The trust that had allowed her to operate with minimal oversight for years had evaporated in a matter of minutes. Several residents were already pulling out their phones, presumably to call lawyers or family members to warn them about what they'd just learned. I watched Victoria Sterling's face as the reality of her situation sank in. The room full of people who had once looked to her as a leader were now demanding answers she couldn't provide without admitting she'd been reckless with their safety. Her perfectly controlled image was falling apart in real time, and I could see the panic starting to show through her attempts to maintain composure. But there was something else in her expression too, something cold and calculating that told me she wasn't giving up without a fight. She was already planning her counterattack, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that I'd just painted a very large target on my back. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, with residents forming angry groups and demanding immediate action, I caught Victoria Sterling looking directly at me with an expression I'll never forget. She didn't just look angry, she looked like she'd chosen her next target. Me. I'd drawn blood, and she wasn't done. The way she held my gaze across that chaotic room told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. I had a feeling the real battle was just beginning. Victoria Sterling wasn't the type of person to accept defeat gracefully, and she definitely wasn't going to let a retired landscape architect and some old documents destroy everything she'd worked to build. The next morning, a thick envelope stared at me from the mailbox, heavy, unfamiliar, and full of bad news. Inside was a cease and desist letter that accused me of spreading false and defamatory information and interfering with legitimate business operations. The letter threatened to sue me for damages if I continued making what they called baseless accusations against Victoria and her development project. That same afternoon, I heard a knock at my door and opened it to find 2 police officers standing on my front porch. My heart immediately started racing because I couldn't think of any reason why the police would be visiting me unless someone had made some kind of serious accusation. "Mr. Vance," one of them said politely, "we've received a complaint that you've been harassing a community board member and making threats against a legitimate development project. We need to ask you some questions about your recent interactions with Ms. Victoria Sterling." It felt like I'd wandered into someone else's nightmare, and I was suddenly the villain. I answered their questions as honestly as I could, explaining that I'd simply been raising safety concerns at public meetings and sharing documented evidence of potential problems. The officers were professional but thorough, and I could tell they were taking the complaint seriously, even though they seemed skeptical that I was actually threatening anyone. After about 30 minutes, they left with a warning to keep any future interactions civil and within appropriate boundaries. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept pacing around my living room, replaying everything that had happened and wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake by getting involved in this fight. The pressure was incredible, and I found myself questioning whether I was really helping anyone or just making trouble for the sake of making trouble. What if I was wrong? What if the soil was fine and I'd lit a match for nothing? Was I overreacting to Victoria's business practices? Maybe I should have just minded my own business and let other people worry about their own safety. That lot outside used to be my garden. Now it just stared back, silent, accusing. It wasn't just a garden, it was where the noise stopped. Now it was the noise. The worst part was the isolation. People closed their blinds. HOA fights weren't their business, until houses started sinking, either because they were scared of Victoria's retaliation or because they just didn't want to get involved in community drama. The next morning brought some unexpected information from Agnes. She came to my door carrying an old rolled-up paper that looked like it had been stored away for decades. "I remembered something last night," she said, spreading what turned out to be a blueprint on my kitchen table. "This is the original drainage system layout for this area from 1982. I kept it from when my late husband worked with the city planning department." She pointed to various lines and markings on the faded paper. Back then, they designed the whole drainage system based on the natural tree root networks. Without those trees, water is going to accumulate in ways that nobody planned for. Agnes traced her finger along the drainage lines, showing me how they all converged near where the construction site was now located. The original engineers knew that this clay soil needed the trees to manage water flow, she explained. Remove the trees, and you're asking for trouble. This blueprint proves they should have known better. The implications were staggering. Not only had Victoria ignored recent warnings about soil stability, but she'd also disregarded decades-old engineering wisdom about how this land was supposed to function. That afternoon, my phone rang with a call that would change everything. Clara Monroe, the HOA secretary who'd been sending me those dismissive form letter responses, called and asked if we could meet privately. This wasn't the robotic Clara I remembered. Her voice trembled, like she'd just stepped over a line she couldn't go back from. "I can't talk about this over the phone," she said quietly, "but I have some information that I think you need to hear." Can you meet me at the coffee shop on Maple Street this afternoon?" When I walked into the coffee shop, I found Clara sitting in a corner booth, looking nervous and constantly checking her phone like she was expecting bad news. She looked different away from the HOA office, younger somehow, and definitely more vulnerable than the confident secretary I dealt with before. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I figured you'd hang up the second you heard my voice. I wouldn't blame you. I need you to know that those weren't really my words. Victoria dictates exactly what I'm supposed to say to residents who ask questions." She set a recorder between us like it was a grenade. It kinda was. I hit record last week. It felt wrong, but what she said was worse, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know it was wrong to record her without permission, but after hearing what she was planning to do, I couldn't just stay silent anymore. I've been working for her for 3 years, and I've seen how she treats people who cross her, but this time it's different. This time people could actually get hurt. She pressed play on the recorder, and Victoria's voice filled the small space between us, clear and unmistakable. I heard her discussing ways to cut safety costs even further, dismissing engineer recommendations as unnecessary expenses, and making it clear that her primary concern was maximizing profits regardless of the potential consequences. But what really shocked me was hearing her talk about me specifically, calling me a troublemaker who needed to be dealt with permanently before I could cause more problems for her project. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, still trying to process everything I'd just heard. Clara looked down at her hands, and I could see that she was struggling with some kind of internal conflict. "I have a son, 8 years old. I kept thinking, what if he lived in one of those houses?" she said finally. "He's the most important thing in my life, and if something happens to the families who move into those houses, I'll never be able to forgive myself for staying quiet. And honestly, I'm tired of being treated like garbage by someone who thinks she's better than everyone else just because she has money and connections." As we sat there talking, Clara told me more about what it was like working for Victoria Sterling. The constant criticism, the impossible demands, the way Victoria blamed her staff for problems that were clearly Victoria's own fault. Clara had been afraid to speak up before because she needed the job, but hearing Victoria discuss putting families at risk had finally pushed her past the point where fear could keep her quiet. She was ready to stand up and do the right thing, even if it meant losing her job and facing Victoria's retaliation. Have you ever been in a situation like Clara's? When I left that coffee shop, I had everything I needed to build a case that even Victoria Sterling couldn't dismiss or lawyer her way out of. But I also knew that having Clara as a witness meant Victoria would turn her considerable anger and resources against both of us. Clara had warned me that Victoria was planning something more aggressive than legal threats, and I could see the fear in her eyes when she talked about what Victoria might do to people who betrayed her trust. As I walked home with that recording in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to face a storm that would make the rain damage look like a minor inconvenience. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't just legal. It felt biblical. The final community meeting was scheduled for the town hall, a much larger venue than our usual community center, because word had spread throughout the county about the conflict between residents and the HOA board. Outside, the sky was dark with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror the tension everyone was feeling about what was going to happen in that room. I could feel the electricity in the air, the kind of atmospheric pressure that usually meant a major storm was coming. But I was too focused on the confrontation ahead to pay much attention to the weather. She arrived flanked by lawyers and consultants like it was a corporate siege. Lipstick perfect, eyes cold. She was wearing her most expensive outfit, complete with jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars, and she had that determined expression that said she wasn't planning to give up without destroying everyone who dared to challenge her authority. She stacked her papers with surgical precision, like facts could protect her from the fallout. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began with renewed confidence, "I want to address the malicious rumors and false accusations that have been spread about our development project. Today, I am going to prove once and for all that these baseless claims are nothing more than the desperate attempts of troublemakers who want to obstruct progress and destroy property values in our community. Furthermore, I am prepared to take legal action against anyone who continues to spread these lies about my professional competence and integrity." She sounded like royalty betrayed, still convinced she ruled this court. Even after everything that had been revealed about her willingness to cut safety corners and hide important information from residents, she was still trying to position herself as the victim of some kind of conspiracy. She threatened countersuits, legal action, full-blown war. Her voice didn't shake, yet her message was simple: stop now or get buried. But then Clara Monroe stood up from her seat in the audience, and Clara stood, and for a second, Victoria's mask cracked. She walked slow but steady, like someone who knew she was about to burn a bridge and didn't care, carrying the small recording device that held the evidence of Victoria's true priorities. "I request permission to address the community," Clara said, in a voice that was much stronger than I'd expected. "I can't stay silent anymore, because if I do, I'll never be able to live with myself for the rest of my life." She raised the recorder. The room went still. No one breathed. "This contains a conversation between Ms. Sterling and the primary contractor for this project, recorded last week in the HOA office. I'm sharing this because the community has a right to know what their elected representative really thinks about their safety and welfare." She pressed play, and there it was, Victoria, in her own voice, playing God with safety codes and lies. Everyone in that room heard Victoria Sterling discussing ways to cut safety costs even further, dismissing engineer recommendations as unnecessary expenses, and making it abundantly clear that her only real concern was maximizing profits, regardless of the potential consequences for the families who would be living in those houses. But the most shocking part was when they heard her talking about me specifically, referring to me as a troublemaker who needed to be dealt with permanently before I could cause more damage to her project. The reaction was immediate and explosive. People jumped to their feet, shouting in outrage and demanding explanations that Victoria clearly couldn't provide. Someone yelled that they were calling the district attorney. Another person said they were reporting this to the state licensing board for contractors. Her empire of control cracked, piece by piece, while her own voice played the wrecking ball. Victoria tried desperately to regain control of the situation, claiming the recording was taken out of context or somehow manipulated, but her voice had lost all of its usual authority. She looked pale and shaken, like someone who just realized that all of her careful planning had been destroyed by evidence she never knew existed. The room was in complete chaos, with residents forming angry groups and demanding immediate action to stop the development project. And that's when nature decided to deliver its own final testimony. The storm that had been building outside finally hit with a force that seemed almost supernatural. Rain began pounding against the hall windows like bullets, and the wind was so strong that the building itself seemed to shake. Through the large windows that faced the development site, everyone in that room could see exactly what was happening to Victoria's precious project in real time. The rainwater was flooding the construction site again, but this time it was worse than before. The makeshift drainage systems that Victoria had installed after the first flood were completely overwhelmed, and water was pooling everywhere in quantities that looked almost biblical. The foundation holes that had been dug for the first phase of houses were filling up like small lakes, and the soil around them was starting to shift and collapse, in ways that were visible even from our distance. Dr. Thorne stood by the windows, pointing out the details for anyone who wanted to understand what they were seeing. He pointed. "We warned you. This is what clay does when it's betrayed." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone could see what would have happened. As we all watched through those windows, the model house groaned, then leaned. Everyone saw it. No one spoke. Equipment that had been brought in to repair the previous flood damage was now sinking into mud that looked more like quicksand. The entire construction site was transforming into a swamp before our eyes, and there was nothing Victoria Sterling or her team of lawyers could do to stop it. Victoria stared through the glass like she could will the site back upright. It kept sinking. Her face went through a series of expressions, from disbelief to anger to something that looked almost like despair. Her foundation was gone, on the land and in the room. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely defeated. "I followed protocol," she kept insisting, but no one was listening now. The evidence of her poor judgment was literally flooding the landscape outside the windows, and everyone could see that her confidence had been built on nothing more than arrogance and wishful thinking. Police officers arrived within the hour, not to investigate complaints about harassing residents, but to arrest Victoria Sterling for fraud, reckless endangerment, and violations of building safety codes. As they led her away in handcuffs, she was still protesting that she'd done nothing wrong, and that this was all just a misunderstanding. The 150-house project was permanently shut down that very night, and the land was eventually sold back to the county for conversion into a public park. 6 months later, I was standing on that same land, watching new green shoots growing up through the soil where my old tree stumps had been cut down. I didn't plant those shoots, they came up on their own, proving that the earth really does have its own memory and its own way of healing. The county installed a small sign that reads Ethan Vance Memorial Park, in honor of those who protect nature and community, which honestly made me cry the first time I saw it. Clara Monroe quit her job with the HOA and started working as an environmental advocate, helping other communities fight against development projects that put profits ahead of people's safety. Agnes McCall was honored by the town council as a silent hero for documenting years of questionable HOA decisions. Dr. Thorne continues to consult on green development projects, making sure that no other neighborhoods have to go through what we experienced. Every time it rains hard now, I don't worry about flooding or soil erosion. I actually smile, because the water has natural places to go again, absorbed by tree roots and healthy soil that can handle whatever nature throws at it. I learned something important through all of this. Nature doesn't seek revenge against people who harm it. Instead, it simply reminds us that there are laws governing the natural world that human beings ignore at their own peril. The site where Victoria Sterling wanted to build 150 houses has become a powerful lesson for our entire community. When we respect the earth, when we listen to the warnings of experts, when we value truth over profit, nature becomes our partner and protector. But when we try to destroy natural systems out of greed or arrogance, nature has ways of showing us who the real authority is. I get asked sometimes if I regret getting involved, if it was really worth all the stress and drama just to save a few trees. But I usually just point to those green sheets growing where the stumps used to be. They say more than I ever could. Truth is, standing up for something doesn't always feel heroic. Most times it's messy, exhausting, lonely. But doing nothing? That's worse. So no, I don't regret it, not one bit. And if you've ever had to fight a fight you didn't ask for, just to keep something good from being erased, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And hey, if you made it this far, consider subscribing to QA Stories. We tell stories for people who don't back down.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.